Welcome to Quinta da Alvarinheira. Although you can only imagine it today, this quinta was once a very busy farm, of medium size and fairly typical of many throughout Portugal. Although those days were not so long ago, yet they were still a very different time and a very different Portugal. Of all the countries in Western Europe, Portugal was one of the last to mature into the contemporary mold of a liberal democracy. But the countryside was the very last area to evolve. The shocks of the 20th century took their deepest toll on the rural populations of Europe. And rural Portugal, having already been a late arrival to the contemporary world, is like a time machine, where quasi-medieval practices existed until relatively recently. Portugal always had a proud history of exploration and huge and extended colonies overseas. But for all of the glory abroad, the interior of Portugal was often ignored. Little attention was given, and even less progress was made on roads and better practices. That was one reason that farming techniques hardly evolved. But often the Portuguese themselves would stubbornly hold on to ancient methods well into the 1960s. Moreover, Salazar's long dictatorship did much to insulate the small country from the radical transformations brought by industrialization and war. And his protectionist trade strategies did even more to keep the interior poor and unevolved. Quinta da Alvarinheira was built in the 1890s, indirectly in response to the greater changes overtaking the world. By that time, it was evident that Portugal would not join the ranks of industrialized countries, in large part because England, its main trading partner, forced Portugal to remain an agricultural economy to which it could sell its industrial goods. As part of this dynamic, the English constructed railroads in Portugal in the 1870s and provided most of the farming machinery. Also at this time, Portugal's urban population was expanding and medicine increasing rates of survival. The country needed more farming to feed its people and for export. To meet these demands, Portugal began a 60-year tradition of trade protectionism to keep 60% of its population that worked in agriculture busy and to keep prices low for urban workers. The result was a farming sector that was practically unevolved. By the 1950s, it was one of the least productive in Europe, with prices too low to improve the conditions of farm workers. And still Portugal's farms could not properly feed its population. The rural population was getting poorer at the same time that Western Europe was making great progress in quality of life. The Portuguese, who for centuries had a tradition of settling far overseas, now began a new and massive exodus towards Northern Europe. Then in the 1950s and 60s came the new farming methods, known as the Green Revolution, and the Quinta's demise was imminent. Fertilizers, pesticides, and crop varieties were the great advances that dramatically increased agricultural production, but they also gave decisive advantages to larger farms, even very distant, which could produce vastly more quantity of food, much more efficiently. And at the same time, in 1968, still a full quarter of farms in Portugal were only using human labor. Thus, Quinta da Alvarinheira, along with the rest of rural Portugal, entered into its current decline. The revolution in farming, along with Portugal's actual political revolution in 1974, brought the contemporary world crashing down into the stagnant countryside, and the old farms, like Alvarinheira, are today only ghosts.